You can't use our long-range missiles to attack Russia on its own territory. Time and time again, this is the message that the West has delivered to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when he's asked to use British Storm Shadow and American ATACMS missiles against Russia. The refusals were based on a good reason. Striking Russia in its territory has long been considered a red line in the Ukraine war. Doing so with missiles provided by Western countries would be even worse, with Russia possibly taking such strikes as one provocation too far. World War III might be the consequence if Ukraine uses the West's long-range missiles in Russia. Zelensky's arguments to the contrary have fallen on deaf ears for over 2.5 years, but now everything has changed. Ukraine finally has permission to use Western-made long-range missiles in Russia. The move represents a massive turnaround in the way the West has approached Putin's special military operation, and it could mean one of two things. Either Ukraine now has a weapon that could help it win the war, or we're all on the verge of a global conflict that Putin has been threatening since the beginning. In this video, we're going to explore the approval Ukraine has supposedly received from the West, as well as the risks posed by the use of these missiles inside Russia. It all starts with the approval. On September 11th, 2024, The Guardian reported on hints that the West was on the verge of lifting its restrictions on long-range missile use in Russia. During a meeting with Zelensky in Kyiv, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that the US has been willing to adapt its policy when it comes to how Ukraine uses the weapons it provides from day one, and that it would continue to adapt as needed. Further comments from British Foreign Secretary David Lammy seem to suggest that such an adaptation would be discussed in Kyiv. Lammy pointed toward Iran dispatching ballistic missiles to Russia as a significant and dangerous escalation that forced a change in strategic thinking in both the UK and the US. The message appeared to be clear. Russia is intent on using foreign missiles in Ukraine, so perhaps it's about time Ukraine could do the same with Russia. However, the conference between Zelensky and his two compatriots came and went with no formal announcement. From the outside, it still appears that Ukraine doesn't have permission to use British or American long-range missiles in Russia. But reports have started to emerge suggesting otherwise. True, there had been no official announcement, the Kyiv Independent claimed on September 12th. However, that didn't mean anything because the UK had already privately decided to allow Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles for long-range strikes in Russia. The newspaper's report cited anonymous UK officials who claimed that discussions took place behind the scenes of the September 11th press conference had proven fruitful for Zelensky. In fact, the entire press conference that served as the public face of these discussions wouldn't have taken place at all if not for a change in policy on missile usage. Euromaidan Press published a similar report on September 12th, stating that the joint visit of Blinken and Lammy to Kyiv offered a strong indication of the decision to allow the use of long-range weapons. A later report by The Guardian on September 14th suggested that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is pressing US President Joe Biden to back his plans to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russia. Look beyond the diplomatic wrangling and it seems likely that Ukraine had in fact received permission to use Storm Shadow missiles however it sees fit. That permission isn't official. The UK hasn't come out publicly to say that Ukraine can use its missiles inside Russia, but behind the public diplomatic wrangling, discussions have taken place that appear to have resulted in Ukraine being allowed to finally cross one of Putin's biggest red lines. Which brings us to a key question: why do Storm Shadow missiles even matter? After all, Ukraine has received billions of dollars in military aid during Putin's special military operation, which has already included Storm Shadows. It's been using the missiles too, focusing Storm Shadow strikes on Russian military positions in Crimea. If Ukraine already has these missiles, why is it such a big deal that it's being allowed to use them to strike targets inside Russia? To answer that question, we need to understand what a Storm Shadow missile is. The result of a joint effort by the UK and France to develop a new long-range missile, Storm Shadow is a long-range cruise missile that can be launched from ships, submarines, and aerial platforms. Each missile measures 16.7 feet and has a launch weight of 2,866 pounds, 881 pounds of which is a high-explosive warhead capable of penetrating defenses to ensure the missile hits its target. We've seen this in Crimea already. Storm Shadows have been able to break through the roofs and similar defenses of Russian military installations in that annexed region to wreak destruction. The BBC dubs the missile the ideal weapon for penetrating hardened bunkers and ammunition stores, such as those used by Russia in the Ukraine war. The missiles are powered by a turbojet propulsion system, allowing them to reach speeds of over 600 miles per hour. However, it's the missile's range that makes it such a threat to Putin. A Storm Shadow can travel for up to 155 miles, meaning that each $1 million missile is capable of striking targets far beyond the front lines established in the Ukraine war. That's why these missiles matter so much to Ukraine. As the BBC reports, Ukrainian cities on the front lines of the war face constant bombardment from Russian missiles, drones, and glide bombs. The latter is especially devastating. In March 2024 alone, Russia dropped 3,000 glide bombs on Ukraine. These Soviet-era bombs weigh hundreds of pounds and have been equipped with fold-out wings and satellite navigation systems that allow them to glide to a target while evading anti-air defenses that are tuned to take out missiles and drones. Each of these glide kits costs between $20,000 and $30,000, giving Russia a cost-effective way to destroy Ukrainian cities without burning through far more expensive missiles. The key to these glide bombs is that Russia can launch them from behind the front lines. Its planes don't need to cross over into Ukraine, meaning Ukraine is helpless to stop them while operating under the long-range missile restrictions that have been placed on it for most of the war. The BBC even notes several claims that Russia's military air bases were better protected than the average Ukrainian citizen because of these restrictions being in place. With permission to use Storm Shadows, Ukraine can finally hit back against these air bases and quell the flow of glide bombs into the country. The Institute for the Study of War points out that Storm Shadows would allow Ukraine to directly strike up to 200 Russian air bases and ammunition stores, many of which lie within Russian territory behind the border it shares with Ukraine. Several key Russian regions, including Kursk, Belgorod, and Rostov-on-Don, would become targets, with Kursk and Belgorod already being subjected to Ukrainian invasions in recent weeks. With Storm Shadow attacks, Ukraine could take out both ammunition stores and Russian troops arriving to thwart its incursions in these regions, effectively securing a new front line within Russian territory. So we have two reasons why the UK granting permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia is so important. With these missiles, Ukraine can take out glide bomb stores and the air bases being used to launch these devastating weapons, providing much needed relief from aerial attacks for its cities on the front lines. Secondly, Storm Shadows could serve as key support weapons for the Ukrainian troops invading Kursk and Belgorod. The missiles could take out key Russian installations and limit Putin's responses to those invasions, giving Ukrainian soldiers on the ground more time to build fortifications and secure the territory they've taken. But there's more. According to ABC News, Ukraine also sees Storm Shadows as a potential catalyst for seizing the initiative from Russia as the war enters a third year. Russia's steady advance into Ukraine is likely to slow down when winter comes. Having long-range airstrike capabilities allows Ukraine to take advantage of that slowdown, as it can use Storm Shadows to take out supply depots and communication centers with pinpoint strikes, thereby preventing Russia from organizing future assaults in the spring of 2025 and beyond. Those strikes could limit Russian air superiority, particularly when it comes to the previously mentioned glide bombs, and could even open the door for Ukraine to create pockets of air superiority of its own. In that sense, Storm Shadows could be an ideal support tool for the dozens of F-16 fighter jets set to enter Ukraine in 2025. The missiles could take out Russian air bases near the front lines, leaving the F-16s, or indeed any other fighter jets Ukraine decides to use, free to support troops on the ground as they push Russia back. At the very least, Storm Shadows could create breaks in Russia's supply lines, damaging its logistical capabilities to the point where its troops aren't receiving the equipment they need. In short, Storm Shadows give Ukraine breathing room. They present a clear attacking threat to Russia that will force Putin to push some of his most destructive assets further behind the front lines, making them less of a threat to Ukraine in the process. The problem, as well as the reason why Ukraine has been so slow to permit Ukraine to use Storm Shadows inside Russia, is that Putin has been making threats. Lots of them. The use of long-range missiles in Russia has long been one of Putin's red lines. Actions most believe would provoke Russia into becoming more aggressive. He's made repeated claims that he would consider the use of Storm Shadow missiles inside his territory as tantamount to a declaration of war by NATO against his country. Those claims were reiterated on September 12, 2024, when reports of the UK secretly allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows emerged. That will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are fighting Russia, he claimed. Al Jazeera also reported on Putin's claims that permission to use the first missiles would amount to direct involvement of NATO countries, while adding that the Russian leader believes this would change the very nature of the conflict. While the exact nature of this threat is unclear, it appears that Putin was saying that escalation will result from Storm Shadows being used in Russia, just as he's claimed for every red line that Ukraine has crossed during the special military operation. More threats came from Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said that Russia believes that Starmer and Biden have already struck a deal to permit Ukraine to use long-range missiles in Russia. Peskov's threat was as vague as most that Russia has made during the war, with the spokesman simply saying that the Russian response will be appropriate. It all adds up to a potential flashpoint between Russia and NATO. If Putin is to be believed, any use of Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia would be tantamount to an escalation at best and a full-blown declaration of war at worst. And if Russia's president feels like NATO is starting to truly represent a threat to his position as his country's strongman leader, there's no telling what he might do in response. Make no mistake about it, there are clear and serious risks involved in allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles. It would be naive to think otherwise. Counterfire made this clear in an article published on September 17, 2024, just days after the news of UK's supposed approval of Storm Shadow emerged. It mentions that the British government has championed vociferously the use of these missiles, no doubt spurred on by Putin's May 2024 threats of retaliation after the UK allowed Ukraine to use other British weapons inside Russia. That event caused UK Ambassador Nigel Casey to be summoned to the Kremlin, where he was told that British military facilities and equipment in Ukrainian territory and abroad could face the full wrath of Russia's military might if it didn't retract its permission. The UK issued no retraction. Russia hasn't attacked Britain. But the fact that such an unambiguous threat was made against the UK has spurred many in the country into believing that Ukraine needs to be able to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia to lessen the threat that Putin poses beyond Ukraine. However, the website also points out that not all in the West support the idea. It notes that Starmer and Biden failed to provide explicit permission for Storm Shadow usage during their meeting on September 13th, suggesting hesitancy on at least Washington's end. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has also shown hesitation, refusing to supply Ukraine with any of his country's Taurus missiles, which are cruise missiles with a range of around 300 miles. Why the hesitation? It doesn't all come down to the threats Putin has made relating to these long-range missiles. Counterfire points out that though Ukraine using Storm Shadow missiles will force Russia to move its military depots and aircraft deeper into Russia, it's unlikely to do much to relieve Russian pressure in the Donbas region. That part of the conflict is primarily fought on the ground, with some air support coming from the previously mentioned glide bombs. Even if those bombs go away, Russia still has the advantage in manpower and ammunition production, with the country producing 3 artillery shells for each one the West produces. Ukraine's priority in Donbas, the outlet argues, is mobilizing enough soldiers to halt the Russian advance, rather than using long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. So a tactical element comes into play. Some Western countries are hesitant to deliver long-range missiles to Ukraine, not because they're especially worried about Russia's response, but because they feel the missiles won't make much of a difference. Remember that each of these missiles can easily cost $1 million or more. The German Taurus costs $1.1 million per unit. Perhaps Scholz believes his country's money is better spent on equipment that Ukraine can put to better use in the Donbas. Still, it's unwise to ignore the risk of escalation. Counterfire points out that some in the West are operating on the logic that Putin is all bluster and no follow-through. His actions up to this point seem to prove their case. Putin's threats of reprisals and nuclear Armageddon have extended to F-16s arriving in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and even a supply of tanks to Ukraine. All of those things have happened without the Russian president pushing the nuclear button. Providing Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine would likely merit the same response. No major escalation. The problem with this logic is that Russia has been escalating, Counterfire claims. It's just been doing it slower than the West expected. The escalation has, so far, remained under control, with Russia strengthening its attacks in response to each of its red lines being crossed. In the case of Storm Shadow missiles, their use in Russia may require significant direct logistical support from the West, which Putin and many in the West may view as equivalent to the West actively getting involved in the war. Scholz himself has claimed that British troops have helped Ukraine with target control for the Storm Shadow missiles used in Crimea, with Putin parroting that argument. The British deny it, but the simple fact that there's such confusion over British involvement creates a danger. There are also fears over the targets Ukraine might choose, now it has free rein to use Storm Shadow missiles. Military depots and airfields are one thing, but what if Ukraine turns its attention to Russia's nuclear sector, civilian targets? What if Ukraine gets an eye-for-an-eye approach and starts attacking cities directly with Western-made missiles? That would create a diplomatic firestorm that allows Putin to claim that the West is committing war crimes against the Russian people by enabling these attacks. As hypocritical as that would be given Putin's actions in the war, Russia killed or wounded 30,457 civilians during the first 2 years of the conflict, the Russian leader would believe he's justified in escalating further if Ukraine used Storm Shadows on civilian population centers. Of course, much of this is speculative. Ukraine likely won't use Storm Shadows to attack civilians or nuclear infrastructure. Given the clandestine nature of the approval it's received, there may have been specific conditions barring them from doing so. But the mere fact that these concerns exist, coupled with the Kremlin's capacity for spinning almost anything into pro-Russian propaganda, means there are clear risks attached to using these missiles inside Russia. In a September 22, 2024 article, CNN also makes the point that the battlefield dividends of Storm Shadow missiles are less than clear. It points out that US intelligence suggests that around 90% of the Russian aircraft used to launch glide bombs are situated at least 186 miles away from Ukrainian territory, putting them out of the reach of Storm Shadow missiles. The relocation of many of these planes deeper into Russia puts them even further out of reach. That might be the point for Zelensky, who would argue that forcing those Russian installations back makes them less effective and gives his soldiers more time to react to incoming glide bombs. Still, moving these airfields deeper inside Russia also means that Ukraine can't use Storm Shadows to destroy them. CNN also points out that even in the absence of these targets, Ukraine can still hit ammo depots and military headquarters with its Storm Shadow missiles, meaning some battlefield utility exists. George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War also notes that the mere threat of permission being granted means Russian aircraft are being pushed further away from the border. The natural consequence is that those aircraft will run fewer bombing missions, while giving Ukraine extra detection and reaction time to deal with incoming bombs and missiles, just as Zelensky wants. Others argue that Ukraine could use Storm Shadows to take out Russian air defense systems. Matthew Saville, who serves as the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, says, if you punch a hole through, actually Ukrainian long-range drones have got better options to penetrate deeper into Russia. This approach would see Storm Shadow missiles play more of a supporting role for Ukraine. They take out the anti-air defenses, clearing the path for the mass drone attacks that have proven so successful for Ukraine so far. More drones means more ground cleared, opening the door for ground troops to establish control in key areas. There's also another possibility. Ukraine being able to use Storm Shadows in Russia could give it leverage in future negotiations. Counterfire makes that point while noting that there's steadily growing support for negotiations within Ukraine following Ukraine's failed counteroffensive of 2023. In July 2024, the Ukrainian think tank Razumkov Center polled 2,027 people on the issue, finding that 44% of the respondents supported opening talks to end the war. A further 21% said they were unsure, with 35% saying now is not the time to negotiate. There is a caveat to these results. Most Ukrainians don't believe those those negotiations would create a lasting peace. Over 80% believe that Putin would only accept an end to the conflict on his terms, which would likely mean Russia claiming the territory it currently holds in the Donbass and Mariupol. Those terms are unacceptable to the vast majority of Ukrainians, the poll claims, suggesting Ukrainian people believe that the country is stuck when it comes to negotiating. Ukraine needs more leverage if it's going to get what it wants out of these negotiations. So from Ukraine's perspective, there's little point in even starting talks until that leverage is in place. Ukraine's recent incursions into Kursk and Belgorod could provide some of that leverage, especially now that Ukraine holds over 450 square miles of territory in the former. Perhaps adding the threat of Storm Shadow missiles could provide the leverage Ukraine needs to negotiate for a complete end to the war that sees Russia keep none of the territory that it's taken. Again, it's all speculation. The only thing that seems certain is that the UK has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia, albeit without making any sort of public announcements relating to that usage. But is that even certain? On September 21st, 2024, Le Monde published an article claiming that the supposed permission to use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia hasn't actually been granted. It quotes Zelensky, who told reporters that neither America nor the United Kingdom gave us permission to use these weapons on the territory of Russia on any targets at any distance. He adds that he believes that both are worried about an escalation in the wake of Putin's renewed threats that a war with NATO will result from the use of Storm Shadow. That claim throws a wrench into the works. On the one hand, it seems to support what we're seeing from the public-facing side of this missile controversy. After all, the UK and US haven't given official permission for the use of their long-range missiles in Russia, and that lack of permission likely boils down to what Zelensky claims, fear of Russian reprisal. On the other hand, Zelensky may be simply upholding the ruse. The permission to use Storm Shadow missiles has apparently been granted privately, so Ukraine's leader claiming not to have that permission could be part of the deal. Don't claim to have the go-ahead, but use the missiles as you see fit. If the latter is the case, you'd have to imagine the smokescreen will evaporate the first time Ukraine uses a Storm Shadow to take out a target in Russia. There's one more possible reason why Britain has permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow. Ukraine may be using the missiles to buy time. In December 2023, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Ivan Havryluk, claimed that Ukraine was working on a modification to its self-made Neptune missiles to give them long-range capabilities. Forbes military writer David Axe says that these modifications focus on extending the physical length of the Neptune, creating more space in which Ukraine can add fuel. That extra fuel could give the anti-ship missiles a 250-mile range, roughly equivalent to the Storm Shadow. So perhaps the goal of allowing Ukraine to use Storm Shadows in Russia isn't merely to give Ukraine more offensive capabilities. The UK could be buying time for Ukraine, allowing it to present a long-range threat through Western weapons while it works on developing its own missiles and ensuring it has the infrastructure needed to ramp up production at home. Where does all of this leave the situation between Russia and NATO? It's difficult to say. While various outlets claim Ukraine can use Storm Shadow missiles in Russia, there's no official confirmation from the UK. Without confirmation, it's difficult to predict how far Ukraine will go with the Storm Shadows it has left in stock. Putin is obviously wary. He's reinforced his threats of war between Russia and NATO if those missiles are used to strike targets within Russian territory. But he could also be bluffing. He's made similar threats about other red lines being crossed before, but has not expanded his special military operation outside of Ukraine yet. If nothing else, the permission to use Storm Shadows inside Russia makes Ukraine more of a threat to Putin, which could give Zelensky leverage in future peace talks, while at the same time buying Ukraine time to develop its own missiles. But what do you think about all of this? Has Britain really permitted Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia? Or does the lack of an official announcement mean Ukraine still faces restrictions on missile usage? How do you think Putin will react if a Storm Shadow is used to destroy a target in Russia? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you as always for watching the video. Now go and check out why the UK has no choice but to go to war with Russia, or click this other video instead.